So to everybody out there, welcome. My name is Matt Hardy. I am the Program Director for Planning and Policy here at AASHTO, and this webinar is the fifth webinar in our sort of our current 12-part transportation asset management webinar series that is hosted or sponsored by both AASHTO, the Subcommittee on Asset Management, as well as the Federal Highway Administration. We have a great little partnership going together with these webinars and a bunch of other activities that we are doing. I'm going to, some of the phone logistics, I put us into what we call lecture mode. So everybody's phone is currently muted. That helps if you put us on hold and we hear that beautiful background music. That won't happen through lecture mode. Towards the end, when we get into the Q&A, I'll give some more information about how to do the Q&A. So that's just sort of the phone logistics. So what I want to start off with is that today's topic. So again, this is the fifth one. Today's topic is about asset management and performance-based planning. If you've been reading the current MAP 21 Surface Transportation Reauthorization Bill or Authorization Bill, you know that two of the larger aspects are asset management. States are going to have to come up with risk-based asset management plans, as well as this notion of performance management and performance-based planning and programming. And what we thought we'd cover today is this topic on the intersection of asset management and performance-based planning. It's an area where I think that there are some states, some MPOs, some transit agencies, sort of where that little Venn diagram of asset management and performance-based planning sort of cross over. And in other organizations, it's, what do the two have to do with each other are sometimes the questions that we get. So that's the topic of today. And just as a reminder, these webinars are held every 2 months. The next webinar is going to be about addressing asset preservation and maintenance and asset management plans. It's going to be held on September 18th, 2013, again at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Same date, same time for all of these webinars, makes it easy. And that webinar in September is going to provide some of the results of a peer exchange that we're having as part of an AASHTO Subcommittee on Maintenance, Subcommittee on Asset Management joint conference, which is happening in Burlington, Vermont, July 22nd to the 25th. Tickets are still available if you want to attend. Hotel rooms are a little more difficult to get at this point, I think. But you are more, if you're a state DOT, MPO, whoever, you are more than welcome to attend. But that one's going to be a good one, sort of focusing in, again, on that sort of intersection of maintenance and asset management, and what does that mean. These webinars are being recorded. If you want more information about the webinars, if you want more information about asset management in general, you can go to AASHTO's website. It's TAM, T-A-M, transportation.org. You can also go to FHWA's Transportation Asset Management site. I forget that one off the top of my head, but I'm sure Steve's going to mention that when I hand it over to him in a minute. But there are lots of resources out there. And finally, if you have any further suggestions on future webinar topics or any questions during today's webinar that you don't get in at the very end, you can send me an email. As I said at the very end of this, we're going to hold all the questions until the very end. So if you want to ask a question, there's a Q&A functionality in the Microsoft Office Live Meeting software service up at the top in the bar up there. It's called Q&A. If you want to type in your question there, whenever you have it, type it in there. I will see it, and when we get around to the Q&A portion, I will be moderating that, and I will ask the question, and the presenters will answer as best they can. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Steve Gay and Harlan Miller, both from FHWA, one from the Office of sort of Asset Management, the other one from the Office of Planning. So with that, Steve and Harlan.
Thanks a lot there, Matt. Federal Highway is happy to sponsor this webinar Asset Management, along with our Office of Planning, and of course with the AASHTO Subcommittee on Asset Management. This has been a subject that's probably a long time coming, of the asset management and the planning and the collaboration. And I think a key is how the planning process and asset management are integrated throughout the process of how a state DOT does business. In the process, the strategic connector to decision-making, development of the STIPs, and resource allocation. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the MAP 21 requirements for development of asset management plans, where it talks about having a listing of pavement and bridge assets, their condition, asset management objectives and measures, performance gaps of desired condition, pavements and bridges, undertaking a life cycle analysis, looking at the whole life, and doing a risk assessment. Also, development of financial plans and looking at investment strategies. And I know from the planning side, there's been requirements for financial plans for quite a few years. Intent being from the asset management side is also looking out something like 10 years, but looking at also the real data needs from what the information you're getting from management systems, etc. Next slide, please. MAP 21 requires states to develop asset management plans for the pavement and bridge assets on the NHS. And we know in some cases, the MPOs and locals are responsible for some of those NHS roads. And it's important that the states and MPOs work closely together. Is understanding that both the state and the local perspective is important in developing the TAM. There are many benefits of tying planning and programming decisions to asset management goals and objectives. Having them well integrated into a performance-based planning process is important. We're going to be hearing more about this topic today. I know several years ago we undertook a peer exchange where we had a handful of states and MPOs talking about how they were working together on asset management. And like Matt indicated, in some cases, the MPOs and the planners were using the information they had and undertaking the analysis. And in some other cases, there wasn't much use of the information from the management systems and analysis. So I'm hoping this webinar today focuses on some of these key issues and has that collaboration within your department so we move ahead with asset management plans that meet the goals and objectives of MAP 21, but just as importantly, better decision-making within the DOTs. Let me turn it over to you, Harlan.
Thank you, Matt, and thank you, Steve. Again, my name is Harlan Miller. I'm in the Office of Planning with the Federal Highway Administration. I'd like to speak briefly about the importance of linkages between asset management and the transportation planning process, particularly about the linkage between asset management and the transportation planning products, such as the statewide plan and MPO plans, and also the programming documents, the STIP and TIP. We've made a lot of progress over the last several years in improving the linkages between transportation asset management and transportation planning. And some people might even say that asset management really is planning or a part of planning. There are new requirements under MAP 21, as Steve mentioned, for a state asset management plan for the NHS, and also for a financial plan to support the state asset management plan. And those asset management plans should support and be linked to the development of the statewide and metropolitan long-range plans and to the state STIPs and MPO TIPs. And MAP 21 increases this emphasis and places a lot of emphasis on system performance, not only in the planning process, but all throughout MAP 21. The planning process, particularly the programming documents, such as the STIP and TIP, is where the financial decisions are made for transportation investments. And needs and priorities that are identified in the asset management plans need to be reflected in these programs in the MPO TIP and STIPs. And the financial plans for the asset management plan should inform the financial plans for the statewide and MPO long-range plans and the financial plans for the STIPs and TIPs. So MAP 21 has provided a lot of linkages here for us between asset management and the planning processes. The states and MPOs are required under MAP 21 to set performance targets, including performance targets for infrastructure as part of statewide and metropolitan planning. They also have to show how their STIP and TIPs make progress towards achieving these performance targets. Information from the state asset management plan regarding system performance goals, targets, and strategies or projects should directly inform the planning process and be reflected in these statewide and metropolitan plans. This does call for greater coordination between the planning staffs at the state DOTs and the MPOs and those staff people responsible for asset management and asset management plans. And our goal is to optimize resource allocation and to preserve and maintain assets. Currently, there are several rulemaking efforts underway at USDOT. As Steve mentioned, this fall there will be several notice of proposed rulemakings coming out. One will be on transportation planning, which will reflect this performance-based approach to planning. We also have rules coming out on performance management and performance measures. There will be a series of 3 rules. The first one's on safety performance measures, followed by a second rulemaking on bridges and pavements, and then a third one on congestion, air quality, and freight. And also, as Steve mentioned, there will be an asset management plan rulemaking coming out at the end of the year. So all of these things are going to be coming out kind of concurrently and overlapping with each other, so folks can kind of review and look at the relationships between the rules and the overlaps between the rules. So, we do have a couple websites that we maintain just for your information, both the Office of Planning, planning.dot.gov, and the Federal Highways Asset Management Office. Steve's office also has a website with asset management information, fhwa.dot.gov/asset. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Hyung Park of Spy Pond Partners, and she's going to give I got one more slide here. Next slide, please. I did want to also show a framework as we move towards this performance-based planning process and also try to integrate asset management into the planning process. We've tried to lay out the framework for a performance-based planning process, and this is essentially what the performance-based planning process would look like. It builds off the planning process as we know it now, where you set goals and objectives and performance measures. Then you do an analysis and look at trends and set targets for those performance measures and look at alternatives and strategies on how you might meet those targets, and then develop some investment priorities. And then you get into sort of a circle. You come out with an investment plan on how you're going to allocate your resources and a program of projects, and then you monitor how the system's performing, evaluate it. There will be a reporting process to periodically report on the state of the performance of the system, and then you cycle back in to look at, did the strategies that we tried make the improvements that we thought, or do we need to change our investment strategies or whatever. So it's a cyclical process where you start over again. And we do have this is a slide out of a guidebook, by the way, that we're working on that will be coming out towards the end of the summer, early fall, on how to develop and implement a performance-based planning process. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Hyung Park, and she's going to introduce the speakers and also go over the agenda for this session.
Thanks, Harlan. I hope you're all here today to hear different perspectives on asset management and performance-based planning. Our presenters today will discuss their agency's efforts to better integrate asset management into their performance-based planning process. Presentations will address specific challenges, success factors, and key benefits obtained, and will highlight successful approaches for strengthening the relationship between asset management and performance-based planning. Together, we will explore the strategic and operational benefits that state DOTs are achieving by tying planning and programming decisions to asset management goals and objectives, as well as the relationship with MPOs. As Matt mentioned previously, the purpose of the webinar series is to share lessons learned, ideas, and knowledge with the asset management community. For this webinar, the primary learning objectives are to build working knowledge of key concepts and definitions in the areas of asset management and performance-based planning, understanding specific approaches to integrating asset management and performance-based planning, and applying this knowledge to begin to answer the following questions. What steps can your agency take to better connect components of your asset management program with your performance-based planning program? What are the benefits that your DOT and MPOs can expect from tying planning and programming to asset management goals and objectives? Let's move to the agenda. For the agenda today, we'll start off by we already started off from hearing from Matt, Steve, and Harlan. I will introduce our speakers before each presentation, but in brief, we have as our first presentation Keith Damron of the Kentucky Transportation Cabinet, and he'll be speaking on their efforts towards a data-driven approach to planning based on asset management principles. We'll then hear about an NPO perspective from Tom Bruff from the Southeast Michigan Council of Governments, that are known as SEMCOG. He will share with us how they're integrating asset management into their planning activity. As Matt described earlier, we will close the webinar with the question and answers at the end. So just as a reminder, you should enter your questions, and at the very end of the webinar, after Tom's presentation, we'll go through each of the questions that are asked, and we'll go through as many as possible within the time allocation. We will work to be finished at 3:30. So with that, let's move on to our first presentation from Keith Damron. Keith is the Director of the Division of Planning at the Kentucky Transportation Cabinet. Keith has worked for the Transportation Cabinet for 27 years in various positions in traffic, highway design, construction, and planning. He has served as the Transportation Cabinet's Appalachian Development Highway Coordinator since 2006. Under his leadership, Keith has led the start of several new transportation programs, including the early project scoping through what is called Data Needs Analysis, or a DNA study, which received the 2011 President's Transportation Award of Excellence for Planning. He's also led the development of a district transportation plan process for project decision making, which received the Federal Highway and STA 2012 Transportation Planning of Excellence Award. And he also led the statewide Highway 50 program called Drive Smart. Keith will speak to Kentucky's experience using asset management and performance measures to make better decisions about resource allocation and utilization, bringing together planning and operations as part of a data-driven process. Keith.
Thank you, Hyena. And also, it is a privilege for Kentucky to be here today and to be able to share in some of the things that we feel good about and that we're doing. One thing I will say before we start, also, it would not be a presentation if we don't have a technical flaw going on. Matt, or if one of you guys could shoot me the email for the entry codes and stuff. I'm in my room and our computer has lost contact, and I don't have the entry code to be able to get in. So I'm kind of going to do this blindsided as I have you guys change the slides for me. But anyway, while you all are sending me that email, we'll go on and jump in. And if you can go on and change to the next slide, make sure that where we're supposed to be. It should be showing $1 billion.
Yep, you're
okay.
Good.
In Kentucky, our cabinet has the availability of $1 billion to let to construction each year. As Kentucky tries to maintain a sustainable level of funding for construction lettings, we're using asset management reviews to try to more wisely allocate our funds to maintain our roads and to identify when we need what we call a new starts project to address a situation needing more funds than a routine maintenance program should address. This allows measuring the anticipated amount of dollars for construction over a 10 to 15 year time span, helping us to provide assurance that we are addressing the operations and reconstruction needs supported by a data-driven process. However, the question that we often ask is, how do we decide how to spend these funds? In Kentucky, we have over 79,000 miles of public roadways, with the state being responsible for over 27,000 miles of those roads. So how do we know where our greatest needs are? Next. Previously in Kentucky, we worked under what may be thought of as a traditional linear project development process, starting with planning, then design, then to construction. Operations was something that just kind of inherited what was left over. At that point, we considered ourselves complete and thought we were going to live happily ever after, or so we thought. But many of our decisions were based on a very subjective, illogical prioritization process with no documentation to support the reasoning. Next. Transportation Secretary Hancock has challenged us to use asset management to better allocate resources to our greatest needs, or to confirm that our funding is being utilized appropriately. We're not just looking at today's needs, but we're also trying to assure that we are taking care of the needs of tomorrow as those dollars are being spent on our roadways. Next. Today, this linear process has been turned into a circle, a continuous process with asset management as the link that connects the operations and maintenance component back to the planning component. Asset management is the connection between how our assets are actually performing and how we allocate resources to make them perform in the future. Asset management helps us to set the vision for what we are doing in Kentucky by being a data-driven process. Next. The Secretary has challenged us to accomplish 3 basic tasks. The first one is the definition of asset management that we are working under is simply using data to define needs. Second is to prioritize and rank needs based on quality information and a well-defined objectives. And third is make better decisions about resource allocation and utilization. Next. We begin with first using asset management in our daily maintenance operations. Like most states, our maintenance is initially focusing on the development of asset management for pavements and bridges, as it is spelled out in the MAP 21 legislation. However, we are beginning with our existing framework for identifying needs and are incorporating new performance measures, developing performance models, and establishing investment strategies. We have begun to develop asset management programs for signs to meet the new MUTCD reflectivity requirements and have started development of the pipes and culvert management program. Ultimately, we plan to incorporate more assets such as guardrail striping, cable barriers, etc. Next. Inventory and condition data are the foundation of asset management, but true asset management is more than knowing where an asset is and its condition. To truly manage the assets, we have to be able to predict its performance over time, to determine the most efficient treatment options, and to recommend investment options. While we have made progress in Kentucky, we still realize we've got a ways to go to get to where we would like to be. Next. Prior to the development of sign management and the district transportation plan, Kentucky's maintenance rating program was the primary operation method for identifying conditions and needs for physical assets beyond pavements and bridges. Since 2000, Kentucky has been rating random roadway sections to measure conditions of features such as ditching, guardrail, striping, and signs. Beginning in 2007, we began using our maintenance rating program data to supplement district maintenance budgets for the purpose of addressing operational needs. Next. Because of the new reflectivity standards in the 2009 MUTCD, Kentucky began to look to sign management as a way to address the new mandate. As we begin development of the management of this new asset, we first have to focus on our inventory, where the signs are, and the conditions of how they are performing. To develop our inventory of existing signs, KYTC has primarily used 2 methods, our photo log data extraction method and our field data collection process using GPS. To determine the condition of signs, we are beginning by conducting nighttime visual inspections to identify signs which fail to meet the reflectivity standards. We are also using these inspections to identify signs which may not be effective due to other reasons. Ultimately, we plan to move toward the use of control signs to determine when a sign should be replaced due to reflectivity concerns. We have built 2 test decks for sign blanks which will be monitored at regular intervals in order to create a performance curve to help guide us. Next. Kentucky's pipe and culvert management program is just in the early stages of development. The program was initiated at the district level. We are using handheld GPS devices that were initially used for the collection of maintenance rating performance data to collect the location and feature data for pipes and culverts. At the same time, condition data is being collected. Next. As we move on into our traffic operations area, we used a union of wet weather crash locations and curb location data in GIS to establish a long list of candidates for our high-friction surface areas. Then we used a minimum crash threshold of 8 crashes in a 5-year period. Once visual verification for the data union could be accomplished, then the individual site visits were made to inventory pavement condition and to confirm the locations where we wanted to apply our high-friction surface areas. Next. In our traffic operations, we're using crash data, mile points, shoulder width, roadway types, and lane widths to establish a list of roadways where center line and edge lines and shoulder rumbles could prevent run-off-the-road crashes. Next. In our Highway Safety Improvement Program has a goal to target the most common type of crashes at the most common locations. Our roadway departures on rural 2-lane highways. We use the data union of our 2-lane rural highways, undivided roadways, with speed limits greater than 50 miles per hour, with crash types indicating that they are definitely roadway departures. Next. The U.S. RAP slide is pretty self-explanatory. We're beginning to use these listed attributes to evaluate and prioritize projects that we receive from our highway districts that are not part of the regular safety initiatives. While these 10 items are the items we're currently using, the program itself will work running up to 52 different roadway attributes. Next. As we move into a more traditional planning for new start projects, Kentucky currently has over 2,400 projects on our unscheduled needs list to add to our operations program as we begin to evaluate new start projects. These have an estimated cost of over $60 billion. Basically, if we do not add anything else to what we have listed with our routine maintenance, our work is taken care of for the next 120 years. Better defining our vision to our asset management allows us to identify what we call our new starts from our normal operation program and through identifying our greatest needs. Next. At the core of our statewide planning efforts are our metropolitan planning organizations and our area development districts that provide our input from our rural areas. Through these relationships, we obtain 2 of the 3 components that we believe necessary to accomplish our planning process, and that is our local officials' input and our public input. But how does Kentucky bring in the engineering component? Next. As we begin this asset management data-driven effort for new starts, the first thing that we had to do was to establish goals to lead planning and our project identification process. The old ways in it was more of a subjective transportation, in a more subjective transportation world were to select a project, then try to justify why it was selected. We decided we needed to establish statewide transportation goals while focusing the objectives in each district based on their specific uniqueness of each area. Next. Our asset management reviews were made possible by creating a spatial transportation analysis map. The process began by applying a very detailed and documented comprehensive review of the transportation needs of each highway district using a spatial transportation analysis map. Next. It began by identifying priority routes for each of our highway districts. Next. We then, using our mapping tool, showing our data spatially, revealed our needs such as crash, congestion, geometric deficiencies, maintenance needs, and a variety of others not listed. Next. Some of these are just a few of the key components that we used out of our highway information system to help to guide us. Next. At each district, we then set up and established a multidisciplinary team made up of persons representing maintenance and traffic operations, our planning office, design, construction, our LPOs, and our area development districts to develop their plan for a region by fulfilling the goals that helped identify the objectives that they had helped establish. Next. This led to 12 individual reports. Kentucky is made up of 12 highway districts. And this led to 12 individual reports, one for each highway district, that was then compiled into one statewide transportation plan for unscheduled projects. Next. The unscheduled needs list was analyzed by the team using the data to set priorities. The highest priorities were determined based on the severity of their needs, as spatially shown on this map of one highway district, and they would then be moved to the unscheduled project list. Next. The unscheduled projects list are then ranked by each district in their district plan, with the top 30 actually being identified and recommended on the unscheduled projects list. These projects included the goals and objectives satisfied being documented. This was something that was not done in the past, that we would have a lot of discussions, but we did not necessarily document the reasoning behind the project. So as these were documented along with, we would develop all of the face costs necessary to complete the project. Next. The district transportation plan results in a listing of data-supported and documented ranked projects based on established goals and objectives. This engineering review complements and includes the recommendations presented from our MPOs and our rural planning committees. Results are a listing of ranked projects used by our governor, by our transportation cabinet, and even to a lesser degree that they are used by our legislators as they draft and complete our 6-year highway plans. Our 6-year highway plan is developed every 2 years. Next. To expand on what Kentucky has already been doing, and as a part of the continuing planning to operation link, we have a team in our cabinet that has been meeting regularly to begin to identify what we need in order to respond to the MAP 21 regulations and expectations, and to take us to the next level in our project decision making in Kentucky in order to assure that Kentucky is meeting our goals and spending our funds appropriately and wisely. We have begun to develop scorecards to show how we are scoring or measuring up in the various areas that's identified in MAP 21, in our safety, our pavement, in our bridges, dealing with delay times and reliability. Next. As we move into the future, Kentucky intends to improve existing management programs to include more assets such as guardrails, striping, rumble locations, friction testing numbers for a high friction surface, sign inventories, and travel speeds. We hope to better identify our comprehensive list of needs and to develop new strategies to address these needs. Lastly, it is to continue to work with and train our staff within our cabinet to understand the planning operation link, to understand how we're trying to use asset management, and to understand the expectations of MAP 21. With that, I do thank you all for this opportunity, and I assume that we'll probably hold questions until the end.
Yes. So if people have questions, please enter them into the Q&A part of the live meeting tool. So thank you, Keith. Our next presentation is from SEMCOG. Tom Gruff, our next presenter, manages the Plan and Policy Development Group at SEMCOG. The group's work enhances decision-making affecting the region and local governments, including ensuring the region has access to federal and state funding. Among his other responsibilities, Tom oversees the maintenance and monitoring of SEMCOG's current long-range transportation plan, Direction 2035, and the development of the newly adopted 2040 Regional Transportation Plan, which he's going to speak to us about today. Tom.
Yeah, thank you. Let me see if there we go. Okay. What I want to talk to you today about is just that SEMCOG's efforts regarding performance-based planning and integrating it with our long-range plans and using an asset management approach. A lot of the things that Keith mentioned as part of the DOT's efforts and focusing on a lot of the transportation areas and infrastructure is very similar to what we're doing here in Michigan. The approach, the Creating Success approach that I'm going to talk to you about, expands that a little bit at a higher level to address many other regional needs. SEMCOG has always taken a data-driven approach when doing its planning and decision-making process. This became a lot more apparent in 2009 when we approved our regional investment strategy as 2035 plan. And then even more recently, last month, when we adopted our 2040 plan, Creating Success with our transportation efforts. This effort actually expanded and identified regional outcomes and performance-based planning. Before I go a little bit further, I just wanted to give you all, if you weren't familiar with the SEMCOG region, where we are located. Obviously, in the southeast Michigan corner of the state, we encompass 7 counties surrounding the city of Detroit. SEMCOG supports local planning through its technical data and intergovernmental resources. Our plans improve the quality of the region's water, make the transportation system safer and more efficient. We revitalize communities and spur economic development. And as the region's designated MPO, we're responsible for the regional transportation plan. So why did we take on this endeavor of creating success in southeast Michigan? This slide is really proof positive that we have been having challenging times within our region, and it demands a fresh approach to the way that we do our business. Our economy is changing, and how and to the extent of government services that are being provided. In this slide, you can see, we'll first talk about the employment on the bottom. Employment in the 1990s in the region grew significantly, almost 15%, but just as fast as it grew, we lost pretty much all of that in the 2000s, roughly 12.4%. The good news is that we've actually reached the bottom of that downturn, and we're starting to see jobs being added even as back in 2010. However, the recovery is going to be very long, and when we do get back into 2040, we will only be at the levels that we were in 2000. Now, looking at the population, again, very similar. You can see that the changes that have taken place. However, the employment growth in the decade will not be as enough to keep up with everyone in the region. What we're seeing there is that the population in 2040 will be slightly higher than that in 2010. So the good news is that we are seeing improvements in both employment and population. However, the recovery is going to be slow, and it won't be to the degree that we were back in the 1990s. So we are a much different region than what we had been in the past. So that really spurs us to think about how we're doing things differently. We kind of asked ourselves in the beginning of the process when we looked at our region is, do we see our region as being the glass half full or glass half empty? And really with a lot of the assets that we do have supporting the millions of trips and millions of dollars that are spent here in the region, we look at what we have as being on the positive as half full. However, due to the economic change, SEMCOG has taken the lead to transform how we work together to align the scarce public resources or revenues to create a successful future. The dynamic of creating success begins with the 6 outcomes that define the characteristics of a successful region. Next come the measures that we use to determine our progress. And then finally, and most importantly, we need to perform an evaluation of the actions that we take in order to and see how they contribute to these outcomes. If we're not doing the right things, we don't want to continue doing those. We want to improve upon what we're doing. So let me repeat it. It's very critically important to measure progress towards success because the right measures will drive concrete actions and investment of scarce resources that will lead us to achieving our shared outcomes. So in developing the new plan, we looked at transportation we typically look at transportation from a narrow perspective of current and future needs for safely and efficiently moving people around the region to work, healthcare, shopping, schools, and other activities and destinations. But more importantly, in this plan, we've taken a much more far-reaching look at SEMCOG's Creating Success initiative, which lays the groundwork for this broader look. So we're asking ourselves, how will transportation investment lead us to the greatest possible economic prosperity? How will transportation investment make our communities more desirable for ourselves and the future workers, we will need to create that economic prosperity. How do we maintain and enhance fiscally sustainable public services? How do we ensure reliable quality infrastructure, particularly our transportation infrastructure? How do we preserve and enhance healthy, attractive environmental assets? How do we ensure access to jobs, markets, and amenities for all the individuals and the region's businesses? These are the outcomes that we gleaned from the SEMCOG plans, as well as the activities of working with others in the region to develop these outcomes. As I mentioned earlier, SEMCOG has a long history with tracking performance measures like bridge, pavement, safety, transit, non-motorized, and congestion. The question is, progress towards what? In our case, this progress is towards creating a successful region by realizing the 6 interrelated outcomes that collectively create success for our region's residents, governments, businesses, and others. These shared outcomes guide the measures we select. However, all the performance measures are not equal. Some measures drive the type of activities that propel us towards success, while others won't. Some measures may appear to foster positive results, but in actuality, not realizing the greatest good, or may result in unintended consequences. An example of this is jobs creation. What we might choose as a performance measure is that we want to grow any type of job. What will that do? That will reduce unemployment. However, what that may also create is a lot of low-paying jobs that might not be able to maintain a typical household. So we really need to be careful in the types of measures that we consider. In return, in terms of the outcome of reliable quality infrastructure, and this is one that I'm going to go into a little bit more detail. Here what we see is that we're not investing enough in our pavement conditions. You can see that by the red line on the chart, which indicates the growing percentage of poor pavement within the region. This is something that we've been tracking through an asset management effort statewide, where we go out every year and collect half of the pavement condition, or the pavement condition on half the roads of the federally eligible system. And this is a statewide effort led by our statewide asset management council. So unfortunately, by the lack of investment comes with a bigger price tag. By deferring the treatment to the future years, it's estimated that the cost will double. And this cost from 2004 to 2012 is looked at as something of going from just under $1 billion to just over $2 billion. So it's because that we've collected condition data for all the eligible roads since 2004 that allows us to perform analysis of various strategies and budget scenarios for improving roadway conditions. And this is using a tool, Asset Manager NT, which is something available to everybody out there. And this is something that was tailored for our use in the SEMCOG region. So what these charts show are different mixes of fixes using capital preventative maintenance, rehabilitation, and reconstruction treatments. At the top right and lower left, the graphs show more of a rehab and reconstruction effort. So we're spending a bigger percentage of our budget on rehab and reconstruction, whereas the top left and lower right stress more use of capital preventative maintenance. So, and the different color lines along the chart are showing the various annual budgets. Red is a do nothing, and the purple is spending $6 million per year. This slide shows the regionally preferred strategy of spending 33% equally amongst the 3 different treatments: capital preventive maintenance, rehab, and reconstruction. So this analysis, along with examples like the one shown here on this slide, clearly show that it's not just what we spend, but how we spend it. If we spend 10% on prevention of a $400 million budget, we actually may see the conditions of roads deteriorating even further, from 70% good and fair to 40%. However, if we spend 50% on capital preventative maintenance, we can actually maintain what we have. And again, if we spend even more on capital preventive maintenance, the percent of good and fair roads would actually improve from 70%. However, it's great to tell the positive side and explain that to the citizens and the local elected officials, but it's always good to point out the negative side. Even though you have 70% of your roads in good and fair condition, you still have 30% of your roads in poor condition, and that's something to disclose as well. So now that we've tackled pavement, somebody might say, well, we're done, right? And unfortunately, that's not really the case. You know, there's several other transportation assets that we need to perform a very similar analysis on, and this is something that we did through Asset Manager NT. We evaluated different mitigating strategies and different budget scenarios, and once we look at these individually and come up with some optimal strategies, we then need to do the harder part of taking them collectively and coming up with an optimal holistic plan to address all of the deficiencies. I'm going to run through, come back to this later on in my presentation. So not all the 6 outcomes and their associated performance measures are as comprehensive as the last one I described. What I want to run through now is one of the other outcomes is fiscal sustainability. So first, consider, how do we pay for our transportation system? Gas taxes, registration fees. You know, this source of revenue relies upon the consumption of gas. However, there are policies in place that emphasize just the opposite, conservation. So here's an example of what I'm talking about for the SEMCOG region. If you take a look at the top line in pink or purple, you can see what the revenue that we were receiving with the standards, the CAFE standards, back in 2009. As those standards increase, where they're requiring a higher miles per gallon standard, you can see the loss of revenue, annual revenue that we're receiving here. And this shows, based upon the standards that will be in place 2017 to 2025, that we would lose approximately $240 million per year. So next, let's consider transit ridership as part of fiscal sustainability. Transit is something that's vital to the residents of Southeast Michigan, especially as our population grows between now and 2040, where we'll have 25% or a quarter of our population considered elderly, 65 and over. Transit is going to be a very vital mobility option. However, our region does not rank well compared to other similar systems when it comes to ridership, miles and hours of service, and operational funds. Another measure for fiscal sustainability is peak demand. So even though our demand on our system is highest for only a quarter of the day, it really accounts in that quarter for half the miles that are traveled. So actions for lowering the impact or spreading the peak is something that we're making efforts towards. Something very similar, building off of peak demand, is looking at how we utilize our current transportation system. This slide shows the road networks included as part of our congestion management process. The roads in red indicate those meeting our thresholds or exceeding our thresholds for congestion in both the AM and the PM peak periods together. If we were to look at this as separate time periods, AM period and then also the PM period separately, we probably have a lot more red lines on the chart. If we were to look and add the midday peak period, so looking at an all-day congestion, where are the worst roads, we probably would end up with fewer red lines on the map. So why is this important to us? One of the things that we want to do is focus on what are the roads that are congested most of the time, where that's where we need to focus attention on spending our money to improve operations or actually to increase capacity of those roads. However, another thing, or the flip side of looking at congestion and system utilization, is where are the roads in the system that actually have excess capacity? And this chart, again, shows the road network in the region, and those that are identified in red are roads that have excess capacity. We're not utilizing those roads to the fullest degree. So one of the considerations there is that we would downsize those roads or possibly utilize those additional lanes for other purposes, considering like bike lanes for more complete streets, or actually installing some green infrastructure or green streets out there so that we can not only reduce the amount of impervious surface, but then maybe also reduce the number of lanes that we need to maintain for traffic. So as we developed the Creating Success Initiative and the performance-based planning approach, we solicited feedback from the public through an infrastructure survey. So what we heard is regarding the current funding methods, few believe that the current level of funding was really adequate, 29%. And nearly half believe that the current funding ways really won't work in the future, 49%. And while 70% indicated that more funding is needed, 73% also said that it's not the amount of funding that is the problem, it's how efficiently we're using the money. So as we go through and monitor the actions of what we're doing, we really need to talk about the success stories of the things that we're doing. Not everything is necessarily a ribbon-cutting activity. It's not sexy. But those are the messages that we need to convey to the public as well as our local elected officials so that they understand that the money is being used in the most efficient way. We are applying the right fixes at the right times. Responses also indicated that there's awareness of how important our transportation system is. Again, from the responses here, you can see that they're very aware that the road system impacts each one of us, that public transportation impacts each one of us, that the condition or better roads actually extend the life of the vehicles that are driven on those roads. Another thing is that they are more willing to change their habits or their behaviors than they are to pay more money. So in order to address some of the congestion out there or some of the other issues, they are more willing to either work from home or potentially take less congested roads to work rather than paying higher taxes or fees to widen those roads. One of the most interesting things that we heard is that they really didn't understand how transportation is funded. 51% think that most road funding comes from local property taxes. So again, it's an education process that needs to take place not only on the funding side, but also on the treatment side. So what does this approach to planning yield? One of the things is we would ask ourselves, do we need to think regionally and act locally? Or do we need to, just trying to get the slide to advance, think locally and act regionally? Well, our response to that would be yes and yes. In order to improve the system, we not only have to have local elected officials think regionally, but we need to have just the opposite. We need to take the regional thoughts and actually figure out how the locals can have impact into that. The shared purpose and shared measures helps us align our actions. These next few slides are going to touch on the importance of aligning the outcomes. So what's shown here vertically are the typical partners involved in addressing transportation issues. Often each one of them often have their own set of actions and performance measures and targets that may not align. So for a better lack of words, we see these silos. When we're looking at water, roads, and others, we may be all taking different actions for a good purpose, but they don't align, so there could be some wasteful spending of funds and actually some actions that might be counter to each other. One of the things that we're looking at there actually is how can we bring the transportation agencies in line with the actions of the utility companies, because often you'll see a road that has just been paved and now it's being torn up to take care of the utilities that lie underneath it. If we can bring those two groups together and have more open discussions on what are the activities over the next several years, we might be able to align those actions and actually provide a better service and save some resources in the mix. So historically, this has been the biggest challenge, is really to breaking the silos. The creating success approach that SEMCOG is looking at is, again, taking those same transportation partners, but using these 6 outcomes, these very high-level vision goals, and determining what are the actions in order to address those goals. Now, this we see because the federal, state, local partners have been involved in the process, that you'll see more of an alignment of the actions in order to achieve these higher level goals. So when developing this process, we need to address both the technical side, asking ourselves, what is the cost effectiveness of various strategies and scenarios? What is the total cost of various targets? And we also need to look at the policy side, asking ourselves, what are the implications of to the transportation system? How do differing targets impact other outcomes? How do we select targets, and how do we assure actions and revenue allocation reflect those targets? So as I mentioned earlier, when I was talking about pavement, and bridge, and safety, and once you analyze the strategies that might be optimal for each one of those areas, which is shown on the table now, you'll come up with a total cost of fixes of $1,500. Well, maybe you don't have $1,500. Maybe you only got $700. So then what do? You then have to go back and look at what are some of the either interim targets or what are other targets that you want to identify in order to work within your budget. SEMCOG in the 2035 plan developed this investment strategy using the Asset Manager NT and coming up with a budget. We provided that information to the local agencies as they developed their projects and submitted them to the long-range plan. And we actually have continued to work within that budget strategy. And those budgets yielded targets. However, one of the things that we're looking at now, again, re-looking at the outcomes, we're going to take another look at the targets that we have in place, especially since going from 2035 plan to the 2040 plan, we've seen a huge reduction in the amount of funds that are available to SEMCOG region and our local agencies. So just to recap, when you take a look at yourself and in your area, don't be too critical. I think about the assets that you do have and build upon those assets and consider the glass half full. It's very important to carefully consider when you're choosing your outcomes, the measures to show your progress, and the actions to get you towards those outcomes. With that in mind, that will lead you to the greater success. I've left you my contact information as well as the link to our 2040 plan. That plan includes many more of the performance measures that we've identified using those outcomes. There's actually 40-plus measures that we have identified formally that we're going to be looking at, similar to what you saw in Keith's presentation, probably a dashboard approach. But there are many, many more performance measures that we'll be looking at. That concludes my presentation.
Thanks, Tom. And before you shut off your mic, your presentation triggered a question for me, and let's just ask it now, which is, given MAP 21 and as you see the Transportation Asset Management Plan requirements and other requirements of MAP 21 related to planning, do you see that you're going to have to change any of the work you've already done in your 2035 and 2040 plans, as well as what are some of the areas of work that you need to focus on, especially in your relationship with the state DOT?
Well, and actually I was going to go through there and pose the question probably to Harlan and ask, that's something that I'm curious about. I think that we have gotten ahead of the curve, as I think you're indicating in your question. We've identified performance measures. We've identified goals and outcomes and performance measures, and the plan reflects a lot of the actions. However, those we need to monitor and evaluate. As far as setting targets and identifying other performance measures, I know that there's going to be performance measures for the CMAQ process that need to be identified. I'm kind of curious myself as to who starts and who finishes that process. I think that it's good that we get out in the forefront on some of that because we can say, well, we've already picked something. But then I'm also curious to know, and we are working with our local DOT on coordination of that. But I'm also curious to know what if either through federal highway or the regs or it could be the DOT as well, chooses different performance measures or targets. I don't know if this one supersede the other.
Thanks, Tom.
In Kentucky, the areas that we see having some problems there with MAP 21 is our pavement bridges and crash information through MAP 21. We've already got some targets. We feel like we've been doing some good stuff there. As we get into trying to determine more of our driver delay actual times and setting average travel speeds in order to help be able to determine those, and to trying to develop some type of reliability indexes on each of our segments of roadways, those are the areas that basically is some unknown territory for us, that we know what to do and how to do. What we don't have is that history of data to where we can kind of rely on as we try to set our targets to know that we're setting a good target or a bad target. So we're going to have to probably take us a couple years to try to develop a little bit of some type of kind of going back to Tom's slides with the measuring stick, something to create a measuring stick that we will know based on what seems realistic versus what good is, what bad is.
Keith, one of the things that our DOT is looking at, just to comment about the operations, is something very similar, using some probe data out there that's available, is looking at how do we reduce user delay costs. So they've identified what those costs are, and then they've identified a goal of reducing that by X, and then they monitor the impacts of what they can do operationally to reduce those things when it comes to construction zones and major incidents. and they've been very successful in monitoring that using that probe data.
We haven't went that route. We have purchased, some of the travel time data, and we are beginning to analyze some of that and to try to see if we can be able to bring that in. And we think we're going to be able to. It's just a matter of reaching a comfort zone on as far as what it means and how we're going to use that in our decision-making process.
Thanks, Tom and Keith. Just another reminder to all of the webinar participants, the slides will be available to you both from the Federal Highways and the AASHTO website, and the recording will be available as well, so you can re-listen to or forward this to others who have not been able to participate just now. So with that, I will turn it over to Matt, who will walk us through the questions that have been asked through the live meeting website.
Sure. So just, this is Matt. So as a reminder, if you look at the top of your screen, the bar there, you should have Q&A. If you want to type in your question, I will just sort of go down the list. First one is from Chris Hunt from Michigan DOT. A question for Keith. Are each of your 8 goals given equal weight when considering and rating projects from the unscheduled list?
That's kind of a yes and no. It depends on what the needs that we're seeing in a particular area or on a particular roadway, how we look at them. That some of the goals don't necessarily, some of those goals may not necessarily, all of those goals may not apply at the same location. So as we try to identify which goals apply based on those objectives that we're trying to accomplish, then that's how we try to weight it. Obviously, when you're looking at safety, I mean, that one always creates a trump card for anything. So it probably gets a little bit more weight than others. Congestion the same way, but all of those, they do have their own merit, and depending what we're trying to accomplish in that given area.
All right, great, thanks. Chris, did you have a follow-up for Keith? If you do, you can hit *6 to unmute. Okay, I'll keep on going. The next one is from Todd Miller. I think again this one is for you, Keith. What is the definition that you guys use for good, fair, and poor for your pavement condition?
I'm going to pass that off. John Wilcoxon is our branch manager over our pavement section, so I'm actually going to let him take that question.
We have a composite rating that incorporates our IRI data along with traffic volume, and then we also incorporate visual assessments performed by our pavement management staff. It's not one number that defines what a poor pavement is. It's kind of a sliding scale dependent upon ADT.
Okay. Next one from Robert Kvam, again for Kentucky. Don't worry, Tom, you will have one in a second. For Kentucky's high friction surface criteria of 8 crashes with the 5-year interval, are projects let for individual areas or bundled into groups?
I'm going to pass this one off to Jared Stanley. He's our branch manager over our Highway Safety Improvement Program and dealing with our high friction surface.
Yeah, the projects to have a large rollout, what we did is we talked with our FHWA liaison, and we actually entered into a master agreement, or some you guys might know them as a maintenance agreement, but it's an on-call services contract that lasted, this one in particular lasted about 2 years, just so we could get it off the ground. And once we evaluated each site, we put together a list of 5, 10, sometimes 15 in the later stages, each individual areas, and we let those out to a particular contractor who held the master agreement with us. And since that agreement has expired, we're going to let those out to a construction contract now. and in the future.
And then a follow-up to Robert's first question was, do you follow up outcomes? Well, second, are follow-up outcomes measured for results? So I guess meaning if you think that these projects are going to have this sort of effect on the overall crash rate or whatever that measure is, do you follow up and say yes, that those strategies did in fact reduce the crash rate or fatalities or something like that?
Okay, I wasn't for sure whether you're just talking about crashes or all categories. If you're talking about HSIP in general, we do keep tabs of the types of crashes we're looking to target. In particular, for high friction surface, we've kept an historical spreadsheet of the date of installation, and then we perform we have a before analysis, and we update the after analysis quite frequently. And we have that housed in our section for combating crashes, in the implementation of rumble strips in particular, for lane departures. That's not as frequent. We're updating our strategic highway safety plan, and as part of that update, we are looking at the reduction in roadway departure crashes and taking a look at the roadways we have installed rumble strips on. So it varies here and there. Some are a little more live than others, but high friction is probably the most detailed information and the main reason is because there are so many states out there that want to know our before and after numbers.
Yeah. Okay. Robert, if you wanted to follow up for any reason, you can hit *6 on your phone to unmute it. I'll hear it, and if I hear you, I'll stop. But there's another question here for Tom. Do you have a transportation asset management plan? And then, if not, are you planning to develop one?
Well, as far as a regional plan, again, what we've done is taken a look at the strategies and said, let's promote spending a third when it comes to capital preventive maintenance, rehab, and reconstruction. However, when we're dealing with our 7 county road commissions and some of the cities, each one of them is in a different situation as far as the overall condition. So what we're promoting and what the Asset Management Council is promoting is that each of these entities that have jurisdiction over these roads needs to develop their own asset management plan. Our role is to help them facilitate that if they ask for our help, and just as we do when we go out and we collect the data on an annual basis. We are the facilitator of that within the region, and we participate on that data collection effort.
Okay. So that's it for the questions that we have. If anybody else has a question, you can quickly type it in there, or raise your hand, I guess. I don't see anybody doing that. And again, the slides will be available, so will the actual presentation to download at tam.transportation.org. You click on webinars, and it'll be there. And I guess one last opportunity, gone. One more question. Here we go. From Corey Baba. Is Kentucky developing a transit asset management plan? And if so, how is this coordinated with your public transit agencies and your MAP 21 TAM?
I'm going to have to admit that our transit is handled in a different section, so I don't totally know the answer to that question. In Kentucky, though, our transit, while we do work with our larger MPOs and help them provide some funding to cover purchasing some buses and some other things, trying to help as we use that with our air quality conformities. Outside of that, I really don't know, other than that air quality conformity, what the checks that they may be looking at. I know that they do monitor riderships, and they do monitor the use as far as the percentages of buses that's full versus locations where buses or vans, that we also help purchase vans that can be used for, work purposes for van pools. But outside of that, I don't really know, and I apologize. And I'll be glad to, if the answer to that question would want to send me an email at keith.dameron@ky.gov, then I could get the answer from the person that would be the expert on that.
I know this is Matt. That's sort of an interesting question, because MAP 21, it's almost like they're stovepipe, for lack of a better term. There's the highway side that calls for a risk-based asset management plan, and then there's a heavy emphasis in the transit section on state of good repair, which is, in my mind, essentially asset management for public transportation agencies. And it seems like at some point we could sort of bring those together, depending on how much or state DOTs are in charge of, fund, or coordinate transit assets. I know that in many states, many of the larger transit agencies, such as WMATA or the CTA, they're their own sort of separate organizations, but at some point there is some sharing going on that, buses do operate on the roadway that are, owned and maintained by state DOTs or, cities and stuff. So having a nice, smooth roadway doesn't just benefit, drivers, it also benefits passengers of buses as well. It could make it more attractive, for people to ride buses, that kind of linkage. I'm not sure it's there right now as we sort of take this step into, performance management for MAP 21, but sort of something to think about, I think.
If I can jump in there, Matt.
Sure.
I mentioned earlier for MAP 21 the requirements for an asset management plan, where we talked about the inventory, the condition, objectives, measures, life cycle cost analysis, risk management or risk analysis, a financial plan, and investment strategies. Those are all directly listed under in MAP 21 for highways. If you look at the language for the requirements for an asset management plan for transit, it does not get into that much detail. And, as we've talked internally, or even if you look at the AASHTO guide for asset management, the guidelines for developing an asset management plan are very much in line with what's in highways. And I don't know, we don't know what's going to come out from the transit side, but to do a comprehensive asset management plan and the analysis to best manage those assets, having that process where you're looking at all those things is the way to go. If you're looking at the AASHTO guide for highways, asset management, international best practice, I'd recommend that as your transit agencies do develop an asset management plan, they do follow those same steps.
We're working on a project through the TCRP E09A project to develop guidance on the transit asset management plan, and that should be available in the next few months.
All right. So now's the actual last opportunity to sort of type in your questions. As we had that, I don't see no other questions that sort of come through. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to you, Yana. Do you want to?
Thanks, Matt. So just moving on to our final slide is a reminder that we will have our next webinar titled Asset Preservation and Maintenance and Asset Management Plans. The idea, as Matt mentioned earlier, is that it will partially be based on the peer exchange that's going to be held in a few weeks in Burlington, Vermont, as part of the Subcommittee on Asset Management meeting. And that you'll be able to join us for that, and that'll be at 2 p.m. on September 18th. And we have additional webinars coming up, so please send us any ideas for webinars you'd like to see, and go to the tam.transportation.org to click webinars to get the recording and the slides for this webinar, and we should have that up there by tomorrow. All right, thank you everyone for joining us today. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.